Hey everyone, welcome back to Citywide Blackout, your home for music, movies, and more. I'm your host, Max Bowen. Murder Meets the Absurd in Summer Club, the debut novel by journalist Katherine Dean Mazerov. In this interview, we talk about what led her to go from writing the news to writing her own book, and the real-life drama that inspired it. We also look at the lessons and challenges that she discovered in the world of book writing. And my next guest, well, she is a longtime veteran of the journalism world, and now she is making her debut as a writer. I am talking to author Katherine Dean Mazerov for her new book, Summer Club. Katherine, welcome to the show. It is great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Max. It's great to be on your show.
I want to just start things off going back to your career in journalism, which began with you working for your college paper to winning the Pulitzer in 2000 with a team at the Denver Post for breaking news reporting. So obviously writing is not a new thing for you, but writing a novel, that's newer. When you decided to jump into the novel world, did you find you had to kind of start over as a writer?
Not really. I will say, you're right. I've been a journalist my entire adult life. I had never aspired to write a book, much, especially a book of fiction. I lived in the nonfiction world. So people would ask me if I'd ever consider writing a book, and I always said, not really. I was influenced early in my career by a couple of trends from the 70s. One, of course, was inspired by Watergate and the subsequent Pulitzer Prize reporting by the Washington Post of that story, which then inspired so many young people to go into journalism. Everybody wanted to be Woodward and Bernstein. The other trend that was happening around that time was one that was called the new journalism. That's a term that was coined by Tom Wolfe, of course, author of The Right Stuff. And it was a movement that basically brought on what became known as the nonfiction novel, where journalists, mostly magazine writers, would write stories using investigative reporting and journalism skills, but also using elements of creative writing to write their stories so they read like a novel. The most iconic of these, I believe, is Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, where he spent thousands of hours interviewing the killers, two ex-cons who had slaughtered a Kansas family in the 50s, and then basically retraced their steps and wrote this book that is one of the best crime books I've ever read. And it's a true story. It's not a novel. And that kind of writing inspired me. And I think it inspired a lot of journalists. I think it had a huge impact on journalism as reporters realized I can do more than just say who, what, when, where, and why, and how. I can create a story and make these people, these real life characters, come alive. And another one was Joe McGinnis, who wrote the book Fatal Vision. He had been actually hired by Jeffrey McDonald, the Air Force Army doctor who was convicted of killing his wife and children. Jeff McDonald hired him to tell his side of the story. And in the course of interviewing him in prison, Joe McGinnis realized, no, I think you did it. And wrote this book that was another great, riveting crime story. So that kind of writing, I had been following that kind of writing. It's hard to really use that in a newspaper because you're so limited by time and space. I spent quite a bit of my life in the features side of the newspaper, which gives reporters a little more leeway in that regard. So I would try to introduce that element into my writing when I could. So when I finally decided to write a novel, I felt like this is my opportunity. I can really use this format for my book. And in fact, back in the 70s, when Tom Wolfe wrote an anthology called The New Journalism, in which he said the best literature being written now is nonfiction. So that, I think, helped me move forward with my novel.
So you said that you had never really aspired to do this, and talking about the books that kind of influenced you, I find it a little surprising that you would go into kind of like not only like a murder mystery, but almost a comedic murder mystery. And in fact, like the tagline for the book, I think is phenomenal: "Murder meets the absurd." I think that is a great like summation for a book. What about this particular genre kind of like drew you to it?
It was a based on a personal experience I had. I quit my job at the Denver Post right after the Columbine shooting. I wanted to be on the mommy track. I had a young son at home. My husband traveled, and I just couldn't. It was just too difficult, and I was kind of ready to move on. So I quit my job and found myself. I'm not exactly Betty Homemaker, but I was happy to be home, but I needed something more. So I started immersing myself in volunteer work and eventually found myself as president of our swim club, a little neighborhood swim club that was very kind of this rundown, dysfunctional place with a leaky pool and cracked tennis courts and an aging boiler. And it was open from Memorial Day to Labor Day. And I became president, much to the dismay of my husband, who said, "Please don't do this." And I thought, after my days in the newsroom of ego clashes and deadline pressure and people's temper tantrums, and which happened on a daily basis, I figured, how hard could this be? I'm going to hang out at the pool. We have a manager to run things. I can play tennis. My son's involved in all these activities. It'll be fine. It's not that hard. I'll have a few board meetings. It'll be great. Well, I was wrong. My phone rang off the hook of people complaining and whining and all these things that were going on. The cheating on the tennis courts, the neurotic swim team moms, the drunken soirees with people behaving badly, power plays, board politics. There was a threatening lawsuit over putting lights on the tennis court. And as the summer droned on, I said to myself, you can't make this stuff up. I've got to write a book. So I started writing the book. And it started out being a running scenario of all these crazy anecdotes and stories, which of course some of the stories are made up and the characters are completely made up. Some are embellished quite a bit from real life people and real life events, although I've disguised them. My characters are basically amalgams, combinations of 2 or 3 people. And I would change the circumstances of the stories, but I would say about 70% of the crazy stories in the book are based on true events. In writing the book, I've always kind of been fascinated in the way people behave in situations. And I think when people are thrown together in a situation, whether it's the swim club or the HOA or the PTA or whatever, you see these behaviors emerge because people come into these situations often with their own agendas. They backstab. They've got, you think it's not going to exist. You think beyond the office, but it does. Everything's political. And so I kind of made it a story about the interpersonal dynamics and universal foibles of human nature that emerge when these people are in these situations. But as I got further into the story, I realized I need a dark element here. I need to create some tension. I can't just make this a book about all these crazy things. So I started trying to come up with some scenarios on how to do that. I researched organized crime, timeshare frauds. Should I make the club a front for drugs and so on? And I just couldn't figure out how to weave that into the story. At this point, I was about a third of the way through the book. So I kind of put the book aside, and then I got busy with some other freelance work and I forgot about it. It sort of sat there for 2 or 3 years. And then a friend of mine I told her about it. She said, "Oh, you should pick this back up." So I did. and realized I needed to figure out this dark element. Then I got wind of an investment scam that a friend of ours had been involved with peripherally with the company. And so I researched that. I researched Ponzi schemes, and I've actually found a case and was able to pull some affidavits and court documents. So that's what I decided was going to be the dark element. And I was able to weave that into the story. And then it just went from there. And that took me about 3 years to finish writing it at that point.
Everything that you've been like looking up, like the Ponzi schemes, timeshare frauds, all these things. Did the research take you down some different paths for the story that you weren't really planning on?
Yes and no. At that point, I pretty much kind of decided what I wanted to do. So I was very specific in how I looked it up. And I had to be careful, of course, and make sure that the sources I was using were legitimate and reliable sources, because as we all know, anybody can put anything on the internet. And I wanted to make sure that I was being accurate, although I kept reminding myself, this is fiction. But even in fiction, you have to be accurate and you have to be realistic about the way things are presented in a situation like this. I couldn't just, I had to set it up so that I was describing it the way this thing ended up coming out, this fraud scheme, that it was logical and realistic, that it wouldn't be I'd want somebody reading it and saying, well, that would never happen. I mean, it doesn't work that way. So I wanted to make sure I was just giving an accurate account of how people set these things up and how people become victim to it.
Because there is always going to be that one person who points out the flaws.
That's right. And I think my journalism experience probably helped me, because my whole life I've had to be very cognizant of that.
Of course. Definitely.
Make sure I'm being accurate. And of course, in the newspaper world, I was reporting on real events, but you have to be, if somebody tells you something for a story, you need to make sure you either verify that or certainly get a different opinion about it. Mm-hmm. So you're presenting two viewpoints.
Exactly.
You aren't just believing what somebody tells you and reporting it.
Mm-hmm. Did your reporting skills really factor into the book itself, or did you have to sort of learn like a whole new set of skills?
In some ways, it certainly helped me. In some ways, I had to make a transition into fiction writing. I had my beta readers and editors and editors help me, who told me, slow down. You're rushing through these scenes, which, working for a newspaper, when you're on a deadline and you have limited space, you don't have time to flesh out the scenes or the characters. So I had to consciously, I felt myself, okay, I've got to get through this scene, so I've got to get to the next thing. And I had to really relax and say, just take your time, and force myself at times to slow it down, give these characters a chance to really emerge, make them more vivid, make the scenes more descriptive. And once I got into that mode, it became much easier. And I enjoyed that. I liked being able to take my time and flesh it out and make it a more riveting scene. I didn't have to limit myself that way. So I found that very liberating.
I know that same struggle it was 700 words, and now we got to get down to like 550. But I would imagine it's quite this just like cathartic experience to be able to say, I can just play in this world for as long as I want.
Yeah, it was. So I got into that. So it was an interesting challenge. I mean, weaving the two sides of the story was challenging, but that was probably the most challenging aspect for me.
Mm-hmm. So let's dive into the character behind the story. Lydia Phillips, a former journalist, now turned president of the Meadow, Glen Swim and Tennis Club, where politics, parent drama, drunken soirees, snarkiness, and sexcapades are basically the 9 to 5. And then there's a break-in at her home. There's a dead body found. And Lydia decides, okay, Time to dust off that old reporter skills and unravel the mystery. I'm curious as to how much Lydia reflects you. And if the answer is not at all, how did you make her distinct from you as a person?
Well, she does reflect me. She, like myself, she's a journalist turned stay-at-home mom who immerses herself in volunteer work. Unlike me, she has twins. She doesn't look like me. Her husband, Bill, is somewhat modeled after my husband, who loves to cook and is a fabulous cook, and he does all this cooking. And I think for me, sort of a subplot of the book, not plot really, but sub-theme of the book is Lydia's personal struggle in fulfilling herself, which I think is what a lot of women experience when they are either trying to balance family and career or decide to quit their jobs and stay home full time after being in the workforce. It's very difficult. It's if your whole identity, if so much of your identity is wrapped up in your work, and suddenly now you're at home with the kids, as important as that is, and as lucky these women are to be able to do that, it's a difficult transition. And so Lydia is struggling with this. Lydia is not exactly June Cleaver. She does not like to stay home and bake cookies and garden and do these things. She just does all this volunteer work because she's used to that action, that activity. And she takes her volunteer work very seriously. So she's busy all the time. And now she's running the swim club and dealing with all that. And after spending all winter trying to get everything ready and perfect, it's not perfect. Things are a mess. And then these problems start arising beyond the club with these strange events, which are introduced in kind of a slow burn way. The book starts out with kind of a grabber. Once I figured out how to merge poop in the pool with a body in the river, then I kind of started out with the dark scene. And then gradually through the book, I started with the foreshadowing of the crime slowly and built up. And as things started emerging, Lydia cannot help herself in trying to track this thing down. She uses her investigative reporting skills to figure out where they find a body in the river. She figures out where he lived, visits the wife, starts tracking this thing down and trying to put all this together. And in a way, she stays a little tiny bit ahead of the police, which is not uncommon in newspaper work, at least in the old days. We used to, at the Post, we had a police reporter who had 3 police radios on her desk at work and had several police radios at home. And she lived and breathed this. I mean, she was practically a cop herself. Anyway, Lydia just cannot stop herself from doing this, to the point that she starts neglecting her kids in a way. She forgets to go to the grocery store, so there's no food in the house. And she goes behind her husband's back and lies to him about what she's doing because he's telling her, lay off this. We've got bigger fish to fry. Just get through the summer. Don't worry about it. But she cannot help herself. So she's conflicted. I guess the question is, when I speak to book clubs, this question comes up: is Lydia a good wife and mother? Or is she self-absorbed? Is she only thinking about herself? She's one of the more multidimensional characters in the book.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering about that, about like what kind of hero is she? Because like you said, she does this thing even though the cops are already on it. She has other responsibilities. So yeah, I was kind of curious myself, like what kind of hero is she? A good one? Is she a bad hero? Is she in it for herself?
I think she's partly in it for herself. I don't really view her as a hero. I think she's definitely the protagonist of the book, but she's not, that's an interesting point you make. I don't view her as heroic. I view her as just somebody doing what she likes to do and which causes problems, certainly for her husband, and puts her life in danger doing it. I mean, she escapes being killed in the nick of time. So, but that's an interesting question. She's not, I don't view her as heroic. I view her as kind of, in some ways, she's kind of crazy. I hope I wouldn't do something that dumb, but
I was going to actually ask, if this had happened, what would you have done?
I would have been very intrigued. I might have done some digging. I might have tried to find where this guy lived. I don't think I would have gone and visited his wife and really tracked all the details down, but I would have probably done some digging on my own. I do that. I still do that. I look things up and I try to figure things out, and I would have been very engrossed in it. But I don't think I would have put my life in danger.
I would hope not. I would certainly hope not. You raised a point earlier that I want to dive into a little more about her being the protagonist, but not being heroic. What makes her not heroic?
First of all, the real hero of the story is her dog.
Oh,
I don't want to give anything away.
No.
But what makes her not heroic is she's just sort of doing what comes naturally to her. She doesn't really save anybody. She figures things out, but it would have been figured out anyway. She sort of causes a lot of problems for herself and her family in doing this. So she's an interesting character, I think, because she does figure it out, and she is able to take the reader on this journey that she's on, and the reader is sort of figuring it out with her. But in the end, I don't know that it would have probably been resolved anyway. And so it's not like she saves the day.
Now, this book was released back in August of last year.
That's right.
And I know that release day for writers can sometimes be a stressful time, but I'm talking to a veteran journalist here, so I'm sure it's nothing new for you. That being said, though, when your book came out, how did you handle that day?
It was technically published in August, but I didn't really launch it until October.
Okay.
I basically self-published. I decided not to go the route of the mainstream publisher just because I know I've heard too many stories of being led down the primrose path, I guess, and nothing comes of it. I don't want to go too far into that, but I decided just to do it myself. Of course, with the pandemic, I realized that getting my book into bookstores was going to be difficult. So I did sort of a little launch where there were certain people I gave books to people. I did a Goodreads giveaway. I reached out. I amped up my social media presence, and I got a lot of response. So I wouldn't say it was stressful. I didn't have specific expectations. I just thought I wrote this book. I felt compelled to write this book, and I'm going to get it out there the best I can. So and people have responded mostly positively, but I think the difference for me is I've had my byline out there for years. And now with a book out there, I feel very exposed. Because
Really?
when I was working for the newspaper, or when I was writing for I've done magazine writing, I've done corporate communications work, I've done lots of different kinds of writing. I had the publication behind me. Now I'm out there by myself, and that's a whole different feeling. And people are judging me and critiquing me, and it's I'm doing pretty well with all that. I realized when I got into this that was going to happen, but that's a very different experience.
Yeah.
But I feel vulnerable.
Yeah, I'll bet. It's like I said before, you have this whole team with you basically, but now it's just you. There's no agent,
Right.
there's no publisher. It's just all you though. But did working as a journalist kind of help ready you for that kind of criticism?
A little bit. My first boss at my first newspaper I worked for, a small little daily newspaper in Southern California, used to say, we publish our mistakes, meaning we are accountable for our mistakes. We can't hide behind them. We have to acknowledge our mistakes. We have to run corrections, clarifications. We're out there. We're exposing, when we make a mistake, we're exposing ourselves. And I always remembered that. And I can't think offhand of a really bad mistake I made in a story that required a correction. As an editor, I had reporters who would make mistakes, but and we would run a correction, and it was just sort of, okay, we'll run a correction, no big deal, unless it was unless we were sued or something. But I never experienced that. But it was just expected. So I know this is not a perfect world. I know people make mistakes, and there are people who like my book a lot because the book resonates with them. They've been there. They can read these characters and say, I know that person. I am that person. I've been in that situation. There are other people who've read my book, and either it's not enough of a suspense book for them, and they don't really appreciate the other side of the story, sort of the funny, comical side of the club shenanigans. They maybe not experience that dynamic, so they don't appreciate it, and that's fine. I mean, I don't take that personally at all. I think no book is going to resonate with everybody.
Oh yeah, I mean, taste is so subjective. Like for some people. Actually, a comedian that I'm a huge fan of put it best. He said, "One man's To Kill a Mockingbird is another man's Twilight Saga." Very accurate.
That's great. I love that.
Yeah,
that's great.
Very good point. And taste can be so subjective. So you're right. You're never going to make everyone happy with anything you write. Doesn't matter what it is. Someone's always going to find fault with it. What's some of the better praise you got, though?
They say, this reminds me of an experience I had, not just at my swim club, but at any kind of volunteers board situation, organized group kind of thing. They like the characters. They like the fact that the characters are very vivid. They like, once they get into the crime part of the book and the book arcs with that, they like that. They like following the story of the crime, the mystery, the suspense, following Lydia. They like Lydia. They like Lydia as a character a lot. They don't necessarily like her personally, but they like the fact that she's a vivid, compelling character. And they like the scenes. They like it that it's a fun, easy read. It's kind of being billed as a beach book. This is not a heavy-duty crime book, or I would not call this a cozy mystery. It's got a little bit of an edge to it, I think, for a cozy mystery, but it's a fun, easy read. And when I introduced the crime aspect of the story, I was very conscious of keeping that fun, easy tone of the book. Even, for example, there's a murder, but the readers don't experience the murder. It sort of happens before the story starts. And I didn't want to get into the forensics of it particularly heavily. I didn't want to make it real graphic, because I didn't want I didn't want the book to make that pivot into suddenly now more of a hardcore crime book. So I wanted to keep it. I mean, I suppose you could describe my book as a caper, although the crime does involve a murder, and there is some minor suggested violence in it. But I wanted to keep the tone of the book fun, at the same time providing some suspense to keep the reader. So I wanted to entertain the reader and make the reader laugh. I also wanted the reader to be intrigued and know that this story has something more to it, and that something bad is happening, that things are not well here. There's a problem. Things are amiss. Something's awry. to give them something more to follow.
You talked about working with beta readers, and certainly they can be the best tool, I think, for any writer to just have that group to give this thing a solid read and be fearless in their criticism. I would like to ask you how the first draft of the book compared to the final one.
Very different.
Really?
They were
how
really
so?
different. Well, I don't wish this on anybody. I am not an outliner. I'll do a very basic rudimentary outline, but I know many authors will do a 30, 40, 50 page outline, which I admire. I wish I could do that. I like to think it's because when I was a reporter, there was no time to do an outline. You did not have time to sit there and do an outline. You had to just write the story. However, I hated outlines in junior high school, and I was never very good at them. And I don't know if it's because of all the Roman numerals, but I really hated outlines. So I don't do them like that. And I wish I were, I wish I did like outlines, because I know it would make the book easier to write. That being said, I'm very comfortable sitting in front of a computer screen and just writing. I've done it for so much that I'm comfortable doing that. So I wrote my first draft. Then after that, I did rewrite it quite a bit. Again, fleshing out the scenes. The feedback I got was, you're rushing through these scenes. So that was my big rewrite, where I added some things. I made the scenes more vivid and more descriptive, and added some characters and made them more compelling. I wanted people to have an emotional reaction to the characters. So I amped that up quite a bit. And then I thought, okay, I'm done now. So I sent it in to the publisher, and they sent back my galleys and all that. And in reading through the galleys, I thought, I'm not done yet. So they said, just resubmit the manuscript. So I rewrote it again. And again, that's where an outline probably would have saved. And I didn't mind doing that. But I did, and it wasn't a major rewrite like the first one, but I did have to redo quite a bit. So from the time of my first draft to the time of actually publishing, it was 18 months.
Wow.
And yeah, I really massaged it quite a bit, and had other people editing it. And I had an editor. The publisher I used is a hybrid publisher who helps indie writers. And they read it, copy edited it for me, and so on. So I just I don't know how many times I've read my book, but it's a lot. And of course, you read your own work, and that's a problem. Everybody needs an editor. And I am an editor. I became an editor, and I need an editor. So editors and seasoned writers need editors.
Absolutely. Every time. I think any writer who doesn't have an editor is making a serious mistake, and it will come back and bite you. So
yes, it
always
will.
hire the editor. It's even if,
absolutely.
I mean, maybe you luck out and you happen to know an editor. Perfect. If you got to hire someone. It's worth the investment. Your book will always be better.
Absolutely.
Given all that, given the work that went into this, was it hard to ship it off to the publisher and say, okay, it's done, no more changes?
It wasn't too hard. I drove them nuts. I'm sure I drove them crazy, because I kept finding things that I wanted to change. I'd see a word repeated in a sentence. Oh, I've got to fix that. I was very nitpicky about it. And toward the end, but after the copy editing and the editing, when I was down to the real nitty gritty of it, I was very picky about it. And I just finally reached the point, I'm done. And I was comfortable at that point. And I'm sure I guess I can draw on my newspaper experience for that too. At some point, you've got to let it go. You just can't hang on to it. And I've worked with people at the newspaper who would just hang on to their stories. They wouldn't let them go. And you got to let it go. at some point. You just can't, you can always try to perfect it over and over again, but at some point if you want to, you just got to do it. And I didn't know how it was going to go. I mean, I again gave copies to people thinking these are people I know, obviously, and I figured, well, they'll be very polite and they'll say, oh, I loved your book. Well, I got very good response to it. I was up all night reading your book. I love this character. I love that character. When are you going to write another book? And so I felt like that was enough for me to say, okay, I'm going to do some other things to get my book out there.
Now, obviously, right now, the traditional book release can't happen. The readings can't happen, the tours can't happen, the so forth.
Right.
But when the time comes, are there any festivals or book expos in your area that you're looking forward to going to?
Not so much in my area. There's a big one, I think, down in Arizona in that's already happened. And I think in February they had it. That's something I have not really looked into, our conferences and festivals yet. Anything that's happening is happening virtually, of course. So that's probably my next thing to look at, are things like our festivals and those kinds of things. I enjoy speaking to groups of people. I'm doing a lot of book clubs. That's sort of my next adventure, I guess, with this book, is as things start relaxing, we get back to some sense of normalcy, is where do I go from here? So I'll have to learn all about that.
Yeah. And speaking of going from here, do you have another book in the works?
I have one in mind. It's sort of along the same lines, and I'm thinking about it. I heard an author say once, think before you write. You have to know how the story ends. And I don't know how the story ends yet, so I'm thinking about it. Somebody asked me too, is the pandemic impacted me? And my initial reaction was no, because by the time the pandemic hit, I was well on my way. I was basically finished writing the book. It was down to the editing and the rewrites, more mechanics that was easier for me to do in a situation where I'm distracted by all these things going on. But now I'm wondering, I am not that motivated to start my next book yet. I'm wondering if it is because of the pandemic and all these things going on, that I'm just not in a good enough frame of mind to do it. In some ways, a pandemic, if you're sitting at home and nothing else to do, it's a great time to write. But on the other hand, I'm tired of being at home. I'm tired of sitting at my desk. I think I need to get out and get away from it for a while and then come back to it. So we'll see.
Excellent.
But yes, I have an idea for a book. So I'm just not quite there yet. I'm busy with this one right now. So
Exactly. Well, Katherine, thank you so much for talking to me. I really appreciate it. The book sounds absolutely amazing. And for the folks at home, you go to Katherine Dean Mazerov, Mazerov, for more information, to order the book, to follow her socials, and a whole lot more. And Katherine, I'm sure we'll be talking more down the road.
Thank you so much, Max. This has been a pleasure. Appreciate it so much.
You're welcome.
Hi, this is singer Kate Eppers, and you're listening to Citywide Blackout.
All right, folks, that brings this episode to a close. You can follow the show on Facebook under Citywide Blackout and Twitter and Instagram under Citywide Max. Listen to the show on Podbean, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, Amazon Music, and every Saturday at 10 p.m. on Boston Free Radio. As always, keep those ears open.